Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. Together we dive into the world of sci-fi and science fiction. From episodes of Star Trek, Star Wars, to The Walking Dead, Resident Evil, all the hot new science fiction movies from the back doors of Marvel or DC. The Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast. You'll never look at science fiction the same way again.
The GSMC Sci-Fi Podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'm your host, Alex. Today, we are going to start talking about the X-Files Extended Universe book, Ruins. I know. You're very psyched about this. I've probably read this book 6 times, maybe, over the years. I first picked it up as a teenager, and I recently found my old copy from like 10 years ago. So, I of course picked it back up, took it to the local brewery, had a few beers, and sat there reading my... It's not fan fiction, you guys, but it's the closest thing I can approximate it to people who don't know about extended universes, is that it's like fan fiction, but somebody got paid to write it. Well, in this case, that person is Kevin J. Anderson. So today, we're going to talk about Kevin J. Anderson as an author of extended universes in different sci-fi franchises. And we are also going to talk about the first few chapters of Ruins, including the setting within the X-Files universe, as well as what's going on with setting the stage. This one is about some Mayan ruins that are in Central America, and Mulder and Scully have to go down there to investigate some stuff. So I really love this book. Kevin J. Anderson has written several of these over the years, and we're going to dive in today. First up is Kevin J. Anderson. Who is this person? Well, if you are not familiar with Kevin J. Anderson, he is a renowned sci-fi author. He has written over like 150 books. I want to say it's like 165 books, and 56 of them have been national or international bestsellers. He has also been nominated for Hugo Awards and numerous other awards. I first came to be familiar with Kevin J. Anderson's work through the Star Wars Extended Universe books, and I really enjoyed his work there. I did not notice until recently, or I'd forgotten. I had to have just forgotten because I really do enjoy his work with Star Wars, but he also wrote Ground Zero and the X-Files book Ruins. So he's done work on multiple X-Files EUs, Star Wars EUs, Dune EUs. So he's worked with Brian Herbert to create a lot of those books over the years. And he's also written original fiction with his wife, Rebecca Moesta, who has also been a large contributor to the Star Wars Extended Universe over the years. Rebecca Moesta wrote a lot of the Young Jedi Knights Star Wars series, and many of those she wrote in partnership with Kevin J. Anderson. So both of them are really into sci-fi and fantasy. Rebecca Moesta has also written for the Buffy the Vampire Slayer EU and the Gorn Crisis for Star Trek The Next Generation. So they are both very much into all things sci-fi and fantasy. Well, not perhaps all things, but very many things that I'm also into. Kevin J. Anderson has also worked with Dean Koontz for Frankenstein, Prodigal Son, as well as a lot of the Dune EUs that come after House Atreides. So House Atreides, House Harkonnen, House Corrino, and then the Butlerian Jihad, Machine Crusade, and the Battle of Corran. So he's written quite a few of these. That's not anywhere near all of them, but it would take me a while to read through all of these with you guys. So I encourage you to check that out online. But he also has worked, in addition to with Brian Herbert and his wife Rebecca Moesta, with some other authors on things relating to sci-fi in general. And also fantasy. Let's be honest, Star Wars isn't a sci-fi. It's a fantasy space opera, and we love it for what it is. But I want to make sure I was clear on that point before you guys come for me. But he wrote Star Wars Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina. He also did Tales from Jabba's Palace and Tales of the Bounty Hunters. And those were some of my favorites as a kid. I was reading these when I was in elementary school, and they had them in my elementary school library. I was very surprised about that because this is well before they started coming out with episode 1 stuff. Episode 1 wasn't announced yet when Tales from the Mos Eisley Cantina came out in 1995, I don't think. So Tales from Jabba's Palace is my favorite. If you're going to start with one of these, it just gives you information about these background characters in the Star Wars universe. So like the Rancor Keeper, and it gives him a name, and you get to find out about his story and why he's crying over this very terrifying beast being killed right after Luke gets there. It gives it a lot more heart in many ways, and I just really enjoyed it. I wasn't prepared for feeling all the feels that I felt when reading these. You get to know about the jars of brains that are associated with these like mechanical spiders. It's almost like Futurama if they gave them the little spider legs for the heads that have been preserved. So there's a whole purpose for that, and it tells you also the history behind Jabba's palace itself. What it used to be before it was a palace, and what the guy with the tentacles on his face is doing. And it turns out he's a Quarren, and his name is Tessek. And they just give you a ton of information. It's really cool. I especially love that they kind of tie things together very loosely in it too. So, like, Tessek is from the planet of Mon Calamari. He's from where Admiral Akbar is from, but that doesn't mean that he necessarily is BFFs with Akbar. It's the type of loose Star Wars stories that I want to learn more about. So, I don't really think that we need an Obi-Wan Kenobi movie, and I didn't think that a Han Solo background movie was necessary or desirable for me. And we're all fans, we all want different things, and that's what fan fiction's for. But in my personal life, the characters I'm the most interested in are the ones that are mostly passing characters, not the main characters. Don't get me wrong, Han Solo is still my favorite Star Wars character, but I like that he has more mystery in his background than anything else, and that there was a lot to think about, like a lot of fill in the blanks, like it's fantasy, and that's like part of the fun, is the not knowing and getting to fill it in with whatever. And, you know, kudos to everyone who has been paid, really, to go and write these stories, because that's really what they're doing, is the same thing everyone else is doing, the rest of us, that they're getting paid to bring these things to life. But I especially like Kevin J. Anderson's approach of telling these stories of the background characters in these Star Wars books, tales from whatever. Like, it's a lot of fun, and it's a very ripe playground for the picking, because there are so many options of characters to choose from that you can't really go wrong with. No one's gonna argue with you about the background of Reyes or Tessek or anything, because you're the only person who's ever written about them. they probably didn't even have any speaking lines, at least not in basic/English. And I find that those are easier to just accept wholeheartedly than a lot of these stories about favorite characters like Kenobi and Han Solo, who were both very prominent in the movies too. I would say that that is one of Kevin J. Anderson's gifts. But he also does a good job with other established characters too. So I like his work in Ruins. He does a great job in this X-Files book in getting his point across with the dialogue. He's very good with like the quippiness of Mulder and Scully when they're bantering, and I enjoy those. I can see them and hear them actually reacting that way in my head. And he also did Ground Zero, as I mentioned before, and another one called Antibodies. I've read all of them, and I liked all of them. If you guys are interested in Extended Universe books, Kevin J. Anderson's works are a really great place to start, and he will have you reading for a while, you guys, even if you are only reading his original fiction or his graphic novels that he's written in, like for Predator or Star Wars or X-Files, Ground Zero, or Dune, House Atreides. It says that one is forthcoming, so they're doing a graphic novel adaptation for that one, and go from there. Overall, though, I'm a huge fan, so that is all coming from me. You check it out for yourself and take my opinion with a grain of salt. But I also wanted to point out that when I was reading through the acknowledgments this time, I noted that he had thanked or acknowledged Christine Catherine Rusch and also Dean Wesley Smith and Rebecca Moesta in this. We already established that Rebecca Moesta is his wife and they routinely work together, but he's also worked with Christine Catherine Rusch, and her husband is Dean Wesley Smith, and those two often write as a husband and wife author pairing as well. So if you're interested in their work or just seeing these husband-wife teams work together, they being Christine Catherine Rusch and Dean Wesley Smith, also use several pseudonyms for things they have written together. And one of the pseudonyms is Sandy Schofield? I'm not sure how you pronounce that. Schofield. And they have written for Star Trek Deep Space Nine, Voyager, Aliens, Quantum Leap, and Predator with that pseudonym of working together. And then also under Catherine Wesley for works like the 10th Kingdom book. So they wrote the 10th Kingdom book that had the 2000 adaptation as a miniseries on, I want to say it was NBC, ABC. Yikes. I want to say NBC, but I can't quite remember. But I remember watching that on television when I was a kid. And so I had no idea that two of these authors I followed for their other sci-fi writing had also written this fantasy TV show that I really enjoyed. Christine Catherine Rusch's name particularly popped out for me because I really liked her book, The New Rebellion, that she published in 1996 as part of the Star Wars EU. And I remember being a little girl, 7 years old, reading this book and getting really excited about it because Star Wars didn't have a lot of female representation in the movies back then. And we didn't have Queen Amidala or anything yet. We were still years away from episode 1. However you feel about that, hey, we had a strong female character or two in that series. Star Wars has been a little bit slower on this than Star Trek, but I digress. My point is that I was very excited as a kid to see a woman writing for Star Wars too. I wasn't getting to see many on screen or in the books, but I was starting to see more behind the scenes. And that was just as exciting for me as seeing Agent Scully on TV and getting that dose of the Scully effect. So for me, reading this acknowledgement section and seeing Kevin J. Anderson's name on this book I found that used to belong to me 10 years ago, when I found that this past week, that was just a really big nostalgic blast for me. So if you are interested in reading EU novels in your area that you love, then check out these artists for everything from Star Trek to Spider-Man and X-Men, Men in Black. Dean Wesley Smith has done all of those, and a lot of these authors have won or been nominated for Hugo Awards, Nebula Awards, and Bram Stoker Awards. Christine Catherine Rush has a Hugo Award of her own for her best novelette in 2001, a story called Millennium Babies. And her husband, Dean Wesley Smith, has been nominated for Hugo Awards as well as Bram Stoker Awards. So no matter where you fall in speculative fiction, they very well may have something in the works for you. And I can't tell if it's a joke or not, but it says that Kevin J. Anderson is currently working on writing up a novel adaptation of Darth Vader's Psychic Hotline. And if you aren't familiar with that, that is a 2002 parody about if Darth Vader was the helm of a psychic hotline, like if he was Miss Cleo and the advice that he would give to people who were calling in, like if Luke called in or Watto, etc. I checked out the IMDb page for it, and it says that Kevin J. Anderson originally did the voice of Luke for this specific parody in 2002, so that may be why he is writing this up now. Might be why he's likely to write it up. When I was trying to tell if it was a joke or not, that's what I checked. So I can't tell if he's just leaning really hard into this joke or if he is actually writing it up. If he does write it up, I am going to read it though. And we can review it then. But for today, now that we have covered the author and acknowledgements, we are going to go on a quick break and start talking about what this particular book, Ruins, is all about. Stay tuned.
Want to find out what movies to go see? Then check out the GSMC Movie Podcast. It's your ticket to the latest movies, whether it's a new blockbuster event, romantic, comedy, or action flick. This show has got it all covered. They talk some what to go see now. Don't bother. What's hot on Netflix and everything in between. That's gsmcpodcast.com/movie-podcast. When it's all about the movies, it has to be this new show. Don't forget to like them on Facebook and follow them on Twitter. Visit gsmcpodcast.com for more info.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about the X-Files Extended Universe book Ruins, especially as it pertains to the author, Kevin J. Anderson, and the folks who popped out at me from his acknowledgements page, including his wife and fellow author Rebecca Moesta, and their friends Christine Catherine Rush and Dean Wesley Smith, who are both also a husband-wife writing team, but also both write separately for their own fantasy and sci-fi original novels too. So, now that we have covered who the author is and how Kevin J. Anderson has had his hands in many different extended universes, from the X-Files to Star Wars over the years, we're going to start talking about the setting for Ruins. So specifically where this is in time, both in real life, if this were following along with real life, and in the X-Files universe setting. So first up, This book came out in 1996, and it was the second book by Kevin J. Anderson within the X-Files universe, following his first one, Ground Zero, which was a New York Times bestseller. In the UK, Ground Zero, which came out in 1995, the year before Ruins, was found to be the Sunday Times bestseller. It was number 1 on the list, and the Sunday Times is the largest in the quality press market category within the realm of British papers. And the Sunday Times British newspaper is also owned by the same group who publishes the Times. Additionally, readers of the magazine SFX, so Special Effects and Sci-Fi and Fantasy British magazine, they voted Ground Zero to be the best sci-fi novel of 1995. And then the next year in 1996, when Ruins was published, it became one of the New York Times bestsellers and was also voted the best science fiction novel of 1996. So this is also a really good book, or at least if you don't necessarily agree with them, it is a greatly acclaimed book. But I really enjoyed it, and I hope that you guys will read along with me and enjoy talking about it too. Since it came out in 1996, which was 3 years after the X-Files came on the air in 1993, it is set in season 3. So it establishes in the first couple of chapters that it is indeed 1996. Mulder and Scully have been working together for a few years now, and so this is a little bit into not just their partnership, but also their friendship. They know each other a lot better now than they did when they were initially looking for Billy Miles. And they've really been through some stuff together since then. Not only running from Eugene Victor Toombs twice and then helping to squish him in that escalator, as we discussed in the last episode on the X-Files, but they've also been through Dwayne Barry kidnapping Scully and taking her as a hostage to his abduction site to make sure that she got taken this time instead of him. So they've been through an alien abduction. They've been through parasites in Antarctica. And we've already been through some classic episodes by now, like Season 3's DPO, Clyde Bruckman's Final Repose, Pusher, Jose Chung's From Outer Space. They've been through a lot at this point. We've already seen Anasazi and everything too. So we've had a really good foundation of who these characters are in and of themselves, who they are with each other, and the mythology for it, really, the lore behind the X-Files, their relationships with the lone gunman as well, and they've established the Syndicate, the shadow government to which the cigarette-smoking man belongs. And we know that there is somewhat of an alien conspiracy, that Mulder is not crazy in any way, and that Scully's not wrong to question him either, because he does sound a little bit batty sometimes, and he does get a bit ahead of himself, often. But it does outright say in Chapter 2 that this is 3 years into them working together. It says that after having worked together 3 years, they had established certain things. So, we know that this is after Season 3. We do not know if it is before Season 4, but Season 4 was episodes like Small Potatoes, Zero Sum, Memento Mori, and Musings of a Cigarette-Smoking Man. It was also the season that brought us the Chupacabra from Season 4, Episode 11, El Mundo Gira. So, we are somewhere between the end of Season 3 and somewhere in Season 4. That's as close as I can get you to the timeline for this. I'm not sure if the Chupacabra episode has happened yet, but that's Season 4, Episode 11. And also Home was season 4, episode 2. So the one that scares the pants off of everyone and is widely regarded as the scariest X-Files episode. It's also the one that had all of the incest and, the local neighborhood people who were murdering folks while driving around in a 1959 Cadillac Series 62 convertible and listening to the song Wonderful, Wonderful by Johnny Mathis. We'll talk about that episode more in a future podcast episode, but I wanted to mention it just to let you know whereabouts we are in X-Files ratings. What has happened before? How dark has the show gotten before? And for that context, Home at season 4, episode 2 is very clear on that. That episode was the only X-Files episode to have a TVMA rating when it was first broadcast, and it was also the first to receive a viewer discretion warning for graphic content. So this is whereabouts the X-Files really starts getting a little gritty. Now, if we follow along exactly with the book Ruins, can you guys hear the apostrophe I'm putting after it? After the S? If we go with its first printing, it came out in May 1996, and the episode Home came out in October of 1996. So this occurs at the end of season 3 and towards the beginning of season 4. From what I can tell, that's roughly where we are. So maybe this is just what Mulder and Scully were doing in the summer when we were all on hiatus. Way back when TV shows ran September through May, along with the school year well before the days of binge watching. So these are like their summer adventures maybe, or at least that's how I am viewing Ruins. So they've seen some stuff at this point. They've been through a lot. They trust each other a lot because they've literally had each other's lives in their hands several times up until now. When I first started reading this book again, I thought, perhaps this is a little bit more violent than the X-Files was getting early on. But I am very wrong, because the one really big complaint that Home had was that some of the violence was perhaps excessive. There were other content issues with it, but it was the graphic content that it got the viewer discretion warning for. Most critics really loved it, but some reviewers did feel like there was excessive violence, and for a while it was temporarily banned from syndication. So that's where we are in the gritty scale of X-Files storytelling. So I thought this was perhaps a little bit too violent, but no, it scans with where things go with Home, like 2 episodes later. And this is also on the heels of Skinner telling Scully that he wants more evidence-based work from her and more by-the-book procedures. He wants clearer conclusions for everything. We know that happened towards the end of season 1 with Squeeze. So it's been about 2 years since then. And in this case, with the book Ruins, Mulder is meeting Scully about wanting to see if there is something extraterrestrial or supernatural going on, not anywhere near where they are, not at all. Mulder wants to go outside of the country for this. This is not one of his regular shenanigans. He has supersized his shenanigans and decided they're going to go into the middle of the Yucatan jungle to go check out why some students have gone missing from an archaeological dig at a newly exposed Mayan pyramid site that is referred to as Sidaclan. This is supposed to be a big discovery, not necessarily for Mulder, although he also hopes it will be one for him, but also for the American archaeologists from UC San Diego who had gotten some funding to go down there and check out these newly exposed ruins that have supposedly remained untouched for 1,000 years because of local superstitions about the area and just the jungle tending to swallow everything around it, as nature does when left to her own devices. So these students from UC San Diego got funding to come down here, and they are checking out the step pyramids and everything, and they have gone missing. And that's when Mulder finds out about it. We also get to see it from their perspective too, just like the X-Files does with that initial cutscene, typically. But we are mostly seeing this from Mulder and Scully's point of view for the majority of the book. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we are going to talk about this group of people that went missing in that cutscene, so stay tuned.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were introducing where in the X-Files universe / when this story occurs, and we have decided somewhere between season 3 and season 4, kind of like during Mulder's summer vacation, which tracks considering that they are going to check out some archaeologists who have gone missing while on a dig. And that's where we're going to pick up now, is with this group of people who have gone missing, because we're going to get more acquainted with them through stories from another character as things go on. So first off, the reason I say that the timing for this being like Mulder's summer vacation makes sense is because that's when a lot of archaeology and anthropology projects in general are conducted, are when professors are not having as many students. Normally the summer semesters give them a couple of months to dedicate to their research. Also during the winter break, sometimes you can get a chunk of research accomplished in those 3 to 4 weeks that everyone has off. You can also do something called buying out your classes in academia, in which you get a grant, and part of the grant money that you've applied for includes essentially paying back the school for how much they would normally pay you to teach classes, but to still hold your spot as a professor. So you're taking like a 1 semester sabbatical, say, in which you won't be teaching, but you're still contributing to the school by building on the body of research and the knowledge base for the field you're in that's also associated with that school. Because when you do your publications, the school's name gets tagged to the end of it as well, and so that brings your school more prestige. So, sociology at work, you guys. But that's something that you can do in academia. However, it can be a pain, and getting enough funding for that can also be difficult. So a lot of this is done during the summer months. It also just takes less money to do a couple weeks long dig in the summer than it would be to do 2 full months. Especially when they're also having to include funding for traveling back and forth between UC San Diego and the Yucatan Peninsula, plus guides to get them through the jungle and everything else that goes along with these type of digs. Not the only thing, but the main thing that really confused me in this is that all of the people who are on this dig are students. And I'm not sure what level of student each of them are. Are they doctoral candidates? Have they already finished their classes and their ABD? So that means all but their dissertation has been finished and they're just finishing writing out that information so that they can publish it and also, first defend it before their dissertation committee. Or are they master's students? Are they first year PhD students? So they haven't done anything but taken their first year of classes from the fall through the spring, and this is their summer project. Are they getting credit for this? I have a lot of questions. Mainly, though, is who is providing the oversight for this? Who's overseeing this project that UC San Diego shelled out a bunch of money for? And then they also got supplementary funding from the local government, specifically the Mexican state of Quintana Roo. So they get matching funding from this local government and the situation to go through and explore these ruins. Quintana Roo is beautiful. It's known for white sand beaches. Folks do triathlons there because it's absolutely gorgeous, and Cancun is to the northeast in this area. Cancun is the largest city in the Mexican state of Quintana Roo. So hopefully that helps you contextualize where and when this story is taking place. But they were able to fly in probably pretty closely to Cancun and then journey out further into this Mexican state to see exactly where these ruins are. And when we find them in the beginning of chapter 1, they've already located the ruins. They've already been there for a couple of days, actually. I'm just mostly wondering for a lot of this how realistic this archaeology crew is. In my experience, typically you have at least a few people who are doing these really big excavations. Like, this is a big deal. This is an intact temple and set of ruins. They're referred to as being ruins because that's also the name of the book. But there's a lot more to it than even just the single temple. There's also a cenote, which is a sinkhole that's very characteristic of Mexico, especially the Yucatan Peninsula area. So these sinkholes often have a lot of water in them, and they can have fish and everything in there. They can be these really neat biomes where the ceiling has just kind of caved in, and now it's very deep and has a bunch of water in it, and oftentimes a lot of plants. Some creeping vines are going down into it, and also there will be tree roots just hanging for dozens of feet as they are reaching out towards this ground below it, this water. They know that it's available there, and that is what they are growing towards. So it's pretty cool, and a lot of people who are tourists will also seek these out to go swimming in them, just because they're absolutely gorgeous, especially since these are often around these white sand areas, and they just have this really vibrant blue color for many of them. But also, in the anthropological context and the historical context, there have been multiple cenotes that have had human remains inside of them with wounds on the skeletons that are consistent with human sacrifice. So a lot of these are referred to as sacred wells or wells of sacrifice, or just sacrificial wells. And they think that the pre-Columbian Maya sacrificed objects and human beings into the cenote as a form of worshiping the Mayan rain god. And so if you go into these things, if you do a dive into them, sometimes they will contain gold, jade, pottery, and incense artifacts, in addition to human remains. So artifacts are the things that people have created and left behind. And that's why they're distinct from human remains. So tools, furnishings, jewelry, clothing, those type of things are artifacts. Toys, artifacts. But if the objects are made by other organisms, like a nest or old pieces of grain or seeds that have been found at archaeological sites, or, animal bones or seashells in places where seashells shouldn't be, those are examples of something called ecofacts. So these are things that come from something living, but they've not been modified by human activity. So once you take an animal antler and start carving on it to turn it into something, well, now that is an artifact. If you make a seashell into a button, that's an artifact now. It's no longer an ecofact because it's now been modified by human activity. And when it gets to the level that this is something that has become a structure or indicates a lot of human usage, like frequent usage, like stone walls or buildings, temples, roads, storage pits, hearths, places where people used to make fires and stuff, then those are considered to be features. So as they're going along and talking about these ruins, you'll hear a lot of these terms like artifacts, ecofacts, features throughout the story. And they'll also talk about the burial practices and the cenotes. So, I wanted to get those terms down for you guys before we proceeded with the story, but that's what they are talking about, and that's what they're looking for with these ruins, and that's why these students are so excited. Regardless of what level they are in college and who funded this and who the principal investigator is who helped them secure the funding for this and who's overseeing the site, who knows? It seems that Cassandra Rubicon, one of the students, is in charge of this, along with a guy in the group named Kelly. So there are about 5 of these students out there, and they each have a different specialty. Cassandra used to be very into geology before she swapped over to archaeology, and that's fairly common in anthropological fields, where you'll be studying something else and then kind of fall into anthropology. So I have professors who were engineering majors first and then ended up doing forensic anthropology and specializing in trauma analysis. So he takes a very scientific and mathematical lean towards studying this. There's a lot of physics in his brand of anthropology. And for Cassandra, in this case, having studied a lot of geology is going to be really helpful for her in giving her a different perspective than someone else who wasn't engineering before, like one of the other characters in the book, John. And it says that John is a grad student architect and engineer who is studying these half-fallen structures. I am all for interdisciplinary studies, you guys. So this sounds really awesome, but also kind of weird, in my opinion, on top of all of the not having a principal investigator and such. From an academic perspective, in my experience, it seems a little bit odd, but then again, this was 1996. I was 7 years old at this time, and obviously not doing archaeology back then. I don't know what it looked like then, and I work with more recent contexts in my adulthood, so that is not necessarily one of my areas of true expertise. But I think along the way, we're going to likely hit up some of my friends who are contract archaeologists and ask them what they think about this, so they can tell us whether this is fairly par for the course. Kelly, in this case, is the team's second archaeologist, and there is a guy named Christopher Port who is also trying to translate the glyphs that they're finding on these ruins. It seems Kelly also is studying the glyphs in particular, So he is using all of the tools to remove debris from the design so it's safe for Christopher to get out his sketch pad and try to translate the glyphs. Then they also have a historian and photographer for the team who also takes her time later on to paint pictures of it. So that's pretty cool. I've never gone through and painted a site. I've had to briefly sketch out drawings of the local area and the vegetation and stuff like that, but I have not painted one before nor seen someone do this. But I thought that was pretty cool. This group of people also plans to go diving in the cenote. Now, the one thing I would like to point out is it doesn't seem that any of them are bioarchaeologists, but perhaps they don't plan on finding any human remains, or they don't think they will. Maybe they'll come down again later with another group if they do find those remains. But it does not seem that that is remotely in any of their skill sets. Now that is actually kind of common, and I have worked with human remains who have been recovered by people who don't work with human remains typically. So that's not all that abnormal. Overall, I found it a little weird, but it's also just fiction, you guys. This is a book about aliens and such. I like that Kevin J. Anderson seems to have put in a lot of work to trying to make this as believable as he can, having not come from an anthropology background, and I can tell he's done some research. And with all of these characters' powers combined, they pretty much make up one Daniel Jackson from Stargate SG-1, with like a small side of Carter. Maybe. And that's just because I'm talking about John being an engineer. Overall, in the first chapter, we get introduced to all of these characters and their individual jobs. And then as Cassandra goes deeper into the temple to really map it out and discover what all she can down there, because they're on a limited number of days to do this preliminary study, and they need a lot of results that are really awesome and solid so they can secure more funding before someone else in academia who also studies Mayan pyramids and Mayan ruins beats them out for it. So, you know, it's academia, publish or perish. And so she's going really deep into these chambers in the main temple. And as she gets deeper in there, she finds that there's some sort of secret chamber that has been partially buried in an internal avalanche of stones. So like a kind of a little bit of a cave-in, but think more like in a mine, just a little bit of one. So she's able to clear away enough debris that she can wedge her body in there and see inside. And she's seeing gleaming metal, which is not golden in color. It is of like the whitish silver color that you would expect from nickel or chrome, things like that. It's very shiny and silvery. And she knows that this is way outside of the context of Mayan archaeology and also what they should have had access to geologically. So she gets very excited. And before she can go further in there without notifying her team of where she is or what she's doing, especially near a collapse in the ruins, she decides to pull back out and go tell them what she's found. It's getting dark anyway. So as she runs out there, everything is dead quiet. She can't find anybody. One of the art easels from Kate's paintings has been tipped over and just absolutely crunched, and there are muddy boot prints everywhere. And at first she thinks they might be playing a trick on her, but it's already super spooky out there because it's getting to be dusk, and they're in these abandoned ruins in the middle of the jungle, and the individual who led them out there, Fernando Victorio Aguilar, and his men, whom had been hired to navigate them out there and then also clear away a lot of the jungle brush, had totally disappeared. They've just gone and fled the camp a few days back. So they're already out there all alone in very unfamiliar terrain when everyone goes missing. And suddenly Cassandra finds herself being confronted by men with large firearms who are threatening her and telling her to come with them. And so she can't see any of her friends or hear any of them. And she takes off running back into the temple and is kind of swallowed by some bright light when she goes back into that little chamber she had found. And she thinks that it might be some sort of escape pod by the looks of it. But a flash of light engulfs her, and then she is no longer conscious. And we don't know what's going on with her or any of the other characters, as gunfire is just petering off in the background as they're firing at something or someone who is not Cassandra. It's all very foreboding, where we leave Cassandra Rubicon and her crew in Chapter 1. We're going to go on a quick break, and when we come back, we're going to discuss what happens in Chapters 2 and 3. Stay tuned.
Watching TV has changed over time. Streaming has become the new norm. That's why Golden State Media Concepts television podcast dives headfirst to the world of cord cutting. Want to be on the loop of what's hot in Netflix? Or if it's not a preference, what about original shows in Hulu? We've got you covered. Join us as we fill in the blank and talk about movies to stream and what show you should be binging. This is the Golden State Media Concepts television podcast.
Welcome back. Before the break, we were talking about Chapter 1 of the X-Files Extended Universe book, Ruins by Kevin J. Anderson. Specifically, the group of archaeology students who are out here studying this, or rather, they're an archaeology crew, but they're not all archaeologists. Some of them are engineers / architects, some are painters and log keepers. It's very interesting how this division of labor is divvied up between these characters with perhaps some oversight. I'm not sure. We'll ask an archaeology friend for future episodes about questions like this. But I will say that when Cassandra says archaeology isn't for wimps, she is entirely correct. Having done some forensic anthropology, which is based on archaeological principles in very warm and cold climes, I will attest to that. It is difficult, but you get fit so fast. If I were able to pitch that for health and wellness, just like the archaeology type of workout routine, I would. Nothing will get you abs and a great upper body faster than planking down into a feature while you are excavating. It's lots of manual labor, but necessary manual labor is my favorite way to get exercise. So I still highly recommend archaeology. If you like to get your exercise that way, or you just want a job where people can definitely not say you're a wimp, then that is certainly a job that is high up on my list for those aspects. It's a lot of work, you guys. It's a lot of work. It's a lot of also sharpening your tools and caring for your tools, and just a lot of screening dirt too to make sure that you've not missed anything, depending on your type of excavation and whether you are truly excavating at all. I'm not entirely sure what they're doing with this fictitious dig. I'm calling it a dig, but it seems that Kelly is just like cutting plants off of the ruins, and Christopher is already elbow deep in translating. So I'm not sure what the specific methods are. They kind of go missing before we get too far into that. But they do mention interesting concepts like elements in the atmosphere changing due to pollutants over the years and how that can degrade artifacts. And that's a very real issue in both archaeology museums and art museums, because a lot of these items have been sealed off, some of them hermetically so, for millennia, decades, centuries, millennia, and they haven't been exposed to a lot of these modern air pollutants. They haven't been exposed to these different types of dust or mold or dirt or dead skin cells or ozone changes or concepts like varnish or solvents or any other chemical cleaners that are used to clean or wax the floors in these places. In fact, you have to be really careful what you clean artifacts and art with, these art exhibits. You can really damage them if you don't know what you're doing, if you're not trained in those areas. And we can see evidence of that in failed restoration attempts like that referred to as Ekimono, behold the monkey. So it was originally referred to as Ecce Homo, behold the man, and it was a fresco of Jesus that was painted in Spain. So it depicts Jesus wearing a crown of thorns, and it's considered to be traditional Catholic art. So this was painted around 1930 directly on the wall of a church. And over the years, due to a poor environment in that church where the painting was, it ended up degrading a lot. So parts of it flaked off because the air quality was so moist. There was just moisture on a lot of the church's walls. And so where the paint was adhering to the wall, it just flaked off. And an elderly lady in her 80s tried to restore the fresco herself because she was upset that parts of it were flaking off. And it's a depiction of, the Catholic Savior. So she repainted it, but she was not trained in doing this and ended up painting this very poorly in comparison to the original. It's way less lifelike, and it almost makes him look like a monkey. And so they changed the name, jokingly, to Ekimono, behold the monkey. And so it's very funny. She did this in 2012. I think it's very funny. And they're still arguing whether this is a new modern work of art because the restoration is now culturally significant, or the restoration attempt anyway, or whether they need to have it professionally restored. So people are still arguing about that, but that's something to keep in mind. She did kind of mess up this restoration because she wasn't trained in it, but also because the place the art was housed, the church wall, was so moist, that in and of itself caused the art, this cultural object, to degrade. So in addition to dirt and mold and ozone and chemical cleaners, you also have moisture content as being an important component of preserving these artifacts and these pieces of art. Mold is especially a problem if you have a damp area because mold spreads via spores. So it can spread throughout the ventilation systems in museums and infect other areas of the museum and damage other exhibits. You also have a lot of museums using special air filtration systems now with activated carbon because that can remove ozone from the air. And ozone can oxidize items and disintegrate them over time. Even the materials that you use to professionally restore or protect the exhibits can really mess them up if they're not used appropriately. You need to be using the correct ratio of certain chemicals in order to preserve human and non-human bone. It depends on what specifically you are preparing these elements for, or these artifacts for. And a lot of museum exhibits are in areas that aren't controlled for airborne pollutants at all. So that means that many of these air pollutants are particulate in nature. So think like tiny bits of sand. They can be very abrasive and can kind of wear away your collections like sandpaper over time. It can especially harm paints and paper. So now a lot of modern museums are moving towards more particulate filtration in their HVAC systems. I wanted to point out that that is true because it seems he did put a lot of work into the research regarding the field of archaeology, especially Mayan archaeology. By the time we get to chapter 2, that's where they're establishing that Mulder and Scully have been working 3 years together. We start out in Mulder's office down in the basement of the FBI building, and Mulder talks a little bit about the history of the Mayan god Kukulkan, who is a winged serpent who is very similar to Quetzalcoatl from the Aztec beliefs. So think Greek versus Roman gods, kind of. They have allegories of each other because there's some, little bit of cultural overlap perhaps. And Mulder refers to them as being these Mayan priest astronomers. And at first I was like, well, that sounds weird. But then I sat there and I thought about it for a minute and I'm like, that's actually really not that weird. If we go back and we start thinking about European priests and how involved the Catholic Church was in getting upset with Galileo Galilei that, he was saying that the earth does not revolve around the sun, that Copernicus was right, and we have a heliocentric galaxy rather than an earth-centric one. And he published that in 1632. However, the Maya were studying astronomy between 300 and 900 AD, like 1300 years before Galileo and them came to that conclusion in Europe. The Maya had such a complex understanding of astronomy that they were measuring time using 2 complex calendar systems. They communicated with one another using one of the world's first written languages, and their written language was made up of about 800 glyphs. So those are about 800 symbols, and each represented a word or a syllable, and you could combine it in essentially an infinite amount of ways. So there are 3 or 4 different ways to write pretty much every word in the Mayan language. They could also predict solar eclipses. If you were around and old enough to remember 2012, then you very well may remember when everyone was kind of concerned that the world may end in 2012, because that is when one of the Mayan calendars ended. I was in college for anthropology, like a year or so before that was becoming a really big concern, or before it was going to potentially come true, quote unquote. And it was predicted that the world was going to end on December 21st, 2012, but there was not really a solid basis for that. I went to a talk at my alma mater for extra credit in class on how this is a misconception totally regarding the Mayans thinking that the world was going to end on December 21st, 2012. Their calendar didn't end then, and there were not any Maya prophecies foretelling the end of the world for that date. And that is coming from Dr. John Carlson, who is the director for the Center of Archaeoastronomy. And the reason all of this came to pass was that some people thought that a planet referred to as Nibiru, which was a supposed planet, which was supposedly discovered by the Sumerians, was headed towards Earth. And the Sumerians were some of the first Neolithic cultural settlements in human history. So this was in an area called Mesopotamia, and this was also referred to as the Fertile Crescent. And somewhere around 7600 to 6000 BC, these different Neolithic settlements start appearing all over Egypt. And that's around 600 BC when that happens. But in this time period, we have the rise of the oldest Sumerian site settled then, and that's around 5300 BC, and then the city of Ur also dates around there. And Uruk and Ur were very important early settlements in human history. They are some of the first civilizations, as we define those anthropologically. So the Sumerians thought that they had found this planet called Nibiru that was headed towards Earth. And there were predictions that this was going to happen. They were going to collide in May of 2003, but nothing happened in May 2003, so that doomsday date was moved to December 2012, and then linked to the end of one of the cycles in that ancient Mayan calendar in 2012. And so that made it at winter solstice in 2012 and made that doomsday date December 21st, 2012. But it was a weird combination of two very different groups separated by space and time and literally an ocean. The Sumerians were over on the African continent and the Fertile Crescent, the cradle of civilization, and at about 6,000 to 7,500 BCE. So, normally we say that the other way around, 7,500 to 6,000 BCE. But you get what I mean. So it was way back then. And then in AD 300 to 900 is when the Mayans were making all of these discoveries over in Central America. So on the other side of either the Pacific Ocean or the Atlantic Ocean, depending on how you look at it. If you're looking at it as being all of Mexico, I mean, it can go either way. The Yucatan is in the Atlantic, but you get what I mean. One of them was in Central America, and the other one was 6,000 to 7,000 years before, possibly more than that, up to like 8,000 years before, on a totally different part of the world on the African continent. So somebody combined these two things and along the way just created an apocalyptic prophecy, which we then all freaked out about. And then I went to that presentation for class and found out it wasn't true. So thank you to Dr. Eastman for sending me to that class. You allayed my fears about the world ending. And just to set everything straight, remember we mentioned that there are two Mayan calendars. One of those is called the long count period or the long count calendar. The other is called the calendar round. So the long count calendar was the one that ended, quote unquote, in December of 2012 on the winter solstice. But it doesn't mean the Mayans thought that time just stopped there or that their calendar just doesn't exist anymore. They didn't necessarily think it was the end of the world. That's just the date that ends that Mayan long count period. But then it would begin again, just like your calendar starts with January 1st in the United States. Then another long count period would be beginning for them. But instead of being on January 1st, theirs would have started on our December 22nd, because the end of their period was that December 21st. That's all. It's just the end of the calendar year. According to scientists at NASA, there are no planets called Nibiru or Planet X that are in danger of approaching Earth and just totally destroying everything around us, just totally ending the world. So they say that that is an internet hoax, and there's no factual basis for this astronomically. If either of these planets were real and headed for us, then the astronomers would have been able to be tracking it for the past decade. And by the time 2012 came around, it would have been visible with the naked eye. So it doesn't exist, or the timing was really far off. I'm going to say it doesn't exist. The astronomers have not found it. But Eris is real, so that is another one, Eris, but it's a dwarf planet, so it's like Pluto, and it's going to remain in the outer solar system. It's not going to come anywhere near to crashing into the Earth and causing the destruction of the planet. The closest that they believe Eris can come to us is about 4 billion miles. So for context, this dwarf planet Eris is only able to get up to 4 billion miles away from us. Like, that's as close as it can get. The sun is 93.958 million miles away, and Pluto is 3 billion miles away. The closest celestial body to us is our moon, and that is 238,900 miles away. So, it is very, 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 very far. It's way past Pluto even. So we're not even able to necessarily reach Mars within our lifetimes right now. Hopefully this next generation will be reaching Mars and being able to return, in that time. But we're not even able to go that far, so you're not really going to be worrying about Pluto or Eris. And by, we're not going to go to Mars and back in your lifetime, I mean my lifetime. I don't have time to train as an astronaut and then get good enough and outcompete all of these other brilliant people and get to go to Mars in my lifetime. But they have said that their goal is to go to Mars in 2030 to have a crewed surface landing, but that will take a long time for them to travel there. It's about 7 months they would be looking at, and that is a little bit longer than they normally stay on the International Space Station right now. Since orbits aren't perfectly circular, though, that also means that it could be anywhere from 6 to 8 months. So we just say 7 because it's right there in the middle, but it could take a little bit, depending upon what time of year folks leave and where in the orbits Earth and Mars are at that time. Overall, it's a super interesting concept, and I'm excited to see where it goes, and to be an old lady wishing my grandchildren a happy, vacation on Mars. I don't know how far we're gonna be along at that point, but I'm excited to see how far we do go. For right now, that's where we're going to stop for today with the content of Ruins. There's a lot of science and anthropology in here that Kevin J. Anderson has put a lot of effort into, and we will continue talking about that along with the plot of the show as we continue reviewing Ruins, the Extended Universe X-Files book. Thank you for tuning in to the GSMC Sci-Fi podcast, brought to you by the GSMC Podcast Network. I'd like to ask that you please subscribe to the show, and writing a nice review always really helps us. Also, if you could please follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, I'd appreciate it. Thank you kindly, and have a good night.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Sci-Fi Podcast, part of the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. You can find this show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, and Google Play. Just type in GSMC to find all the shows from the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network, from movies to music, from sports to entertainment, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and on Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's program.